The shift ended at 2 in the afternoon. Not because something went wrong. Not because the line broke down or the orders ran dry. Because the shift was 6 hours, and 6 hours was enough. The workers at the Kellogg Company plant in Battle Creek, Michigan clocked out at 2, walked home in daylight, and had the rest of the afternoon to do whatever they chose. Some went to their gardens. Some went to their children's schools. Some went to the library, which had extended its hours to accommodate the new schedule. This was not a pilot program. It was not a temporary measure introduced during the Depression to share scarce work across more employees, though that was part of the calculation. It was a deliberate management philosophy implemented in 1930 by W.K. Kellogg himself, based on a specific and documented argument that workers who had time to rest, to think, and to participate in civic life were more productive during their 6 hours than they had been during 8. The data supported him. Kellogg's own records showed output per hour increasing after the shift reduction. Accident rates dropped. Absenteeism dropped. The company's costs per unit of production did not increase in the way that critics of the shorter workday had predicted. For 15 years, the 6-hour day worked. Workers at the Battle Creek plant negotiated to keep it through union contracts. They surveyed repeatedly said they preferred it, even when offered the option of returning to 8 hours for higher pay. The 6-hour day was not an imposition. By the mid-1930s, it was something the workers themselves were defending. Then Washington intervened. Here is what the legislative record actually shows, before the Standard account takes over. The 6-hour workday was not a marginal idea in 1932 and 1933. It was a mainstream policy proposal, backed by the American Federation of Labor, introduced in the Senate by Hugo Black of Alabama, and supported by a coalition of labor economists, industrial managers, and Depression-era policymakers who had concluded that the most direct solution to mass unemployment was to reduce the number of hours each employed worker worked, spreading the available work across more people without requiring new investment or new industries. The Black-Connery 30 Hours Bill, introduced in December 1932, proposed a federal 30-hour work week, 6 hours per day, 5 days per week, for all industries engaged in interstate commerce. The bill passed the Senate in April 1933, not narrowly, by a substantial majority. Senators who voted for it included members from both parties, from industrial states and agricultural states, from constituencies that had direct experience of what unemployment at Depression-era scale actually looked like in human terms. The bill had passed the Senate. It was moving through the House, and it had, at the moment of its passage, something that most labor legislation of the period did not have: a functioning real-world example. Kellogg's Battle Creek plant had been running 6-hour shifts for 3 years. The productivity data existed. The accident rate data existed. The worker satisfaction surveys existed. The argument for the 30-hour week was not theoretical in 1933, it was operational. Suti, and here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of watching a policy that has documented evidence behind it, that has passed one chamber of the legislature, and that has the support of the largest labor organization in the country, fail to become law because of decisions made in rooms that do not generate transcripts, is not a condition unique to 1933. It is the operational description of how legislative momentum is regularly redirected by executive intervention before the full democratic process can conclude. The bill did not fail in committee. It did not fail on the floor. It passed the Senate. What stopped it was not legislative opposition. What stopped it was the White House. Franklin Roosevelt did not support the Black-Connery Bill. His opposition was not ideological in the way that later accounts of the New Deal sometimes imply, Roosevelt was not opposed to labor legislation in principle. He had signed, and would sign, significant expansions of federal labor protections. His opposition to the 30-hour bill was specific. He believed the bill was too rigid, that a uniform federal standard of 30 hours would be unworkable across the range of industries it covered, and that the wage question, what workers would be paid for 30 hours, had not been adequately addressed in the legislation. These were not frivolous objections. The wage question was real. A 30-hour week at the same weekly pay rate represented a significant increase in labor costs per unit of output. A 30-hour week at a proportionally reduced wage represented a cut in workers' weekly income at exactly the moment when workers could least absorb a cut. Maybe the Roosevelt administration's decision to redirect the legislative momentum away from the Black-Connery Bill and toward the National Industrial Recovery Act was the correct policy judgment. A more flexible framework that could address the wage question the 30-hour bill had left unresolved, while still providing the labor protections and industrial coordination that the Depression required. If this were the whole picture, the story would be a familiar one about the necessary complexity of legislative compromise in a crisis. But the record is more specific than that. The National Industrial Recovery Act, which Roosevelt substituted for the 30-hour bill, did not establish a 30-hour week. It established a framework under which industries could negotiate their own codes of fair competition, including hours standards, under federal supervision. The hours standards that emerged from the NERA code process were not 30, they were 40. In some industries, higher. The 30-hour week that had passed the Senate in April 1933 became, through the NERA substitution, a 40-hour standard by the end of the year. Archival patterns suggest the business community's lobbying against the Black-Connery Bill was organized, well-funded, and specifically targeted at the White House rather than at Congress, because the bill had already demonstrated it could pass Congress. The pressure point was the executive, and the executive responded. The legislative record shows what passed. It is somewhat quieter about what was traded to get there. The Kellogg records are where the argument stops being theoretical. The company maintained detailed internal records of productivity, accident rates, and labor costs across the transition from 8-hour to 6-hour shifts in 1930, and across the subsequent years of 6-hour operation through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Those records, portions of which have been analyzed by historians who have worked with the Kellogg Company archives and with the collections at the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State University, document what W.K. Kellogg had claimed when he implemented the change. That output per worker hour increased after the shift reduction, and that the increase was sufficient to offset the cost of employing more workers to cover the same total production hours. This is not a management claim without documentation. It is a claim with a paper trail. The accident rate data is the figure that the historical literature on the 6-hour day most consistently cites, because it is the figure that is hardest to attribute to anything other than the shift reduction itself. Fatigue-related industrial accidents follow a documented pattern within an 8-hour shift. They cluster in the final 2 hours, when worker attention and physical capacity have been depleted by the preceding 6. A 6-hour shift eliminates those final 2 hours entirely. The Kellogg records show a measurable decline in accident rates after 1930 that is consistent with this pattern. The company's own insurance costs declined. The decline is in the records. And here is where the record gets specific in a way that the legislative history does not fully capture. The worker surveys that Kellogg conducted and that union representatives conducted independently across the 1930s show a consistent pattern. Workers at the Battle Creek plant preferred the 6-hour day even when offered the alternative of returning to 8 hours for proportionally higher weekly pay. The preference was not close. Majorities in every documented survey chose the 6-hour day. The reasons workers gave in the open-ended portions of those surveys were not primarily about fatigue. They were about time, about the ability to be present for children, to participate in community organizations, to pursue education, to do the things that an 8-hour day followed by commuting and domestic labor left no time for. Historians who have worked with the Battle Creek survey data note that the workers' accounts describe something that the productivity metrics do not capture: a qualitative change in what daily life felt like and what it made possible. The 6-hour day was not just an economic experiment. It was a different answer to the question of what work is for. And then, in 1943, the 6-hour day at Kellogg began to erode. The mechanism was not a management decision to revert. It was the wartime production imperative. The federal government's request that industries operating defense-related production maximize output, which in practical terms meant extending shifts. Kellogg introduced 8-hour shifts in some departments during the war years, framed as a temporary wartime measure. After the war ended, the 8-hour shift did not leave. The post-war contract negotiations at Kellogg's Battle Creek plant are documented in the Walter P. Reuther Library's labor records. What they show is a workplace divided. A significant portion of workers, particularly women workers who had entered the plant during the war years, preferring the 6-hour day and its implications for domestic life. A different portion, predominantly male workers, focused on maximizing weekly wages in the post-war economic expansion, preferring 8 hours and the higher weekly pay it produced. The union negotiated. The 6-hour day survived in some departments through the 1950s. It was formally ended across the plant in 1985. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different legislative substitution, one where what replaced the original bill was designed to look like the thing it was replacing, and the archive shows exactly when the language changed. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the legislation that established the 40-hour week as the federal standard, with overtime pay required beyond that threshold, is the legal framework that the Black-Connery Bill's 30-hour proposal was ultimately displaced by. The FLSA is not the NERA. It is a genuine and significant piece of labor legislation that has protected workers for more than 80 years. What it is not 30 hours. The overtime threshold that the FLSA established in 1938 has not been adjusted for inflation or productivity growth in any way that reduces the standard work week below 40 hours. In the decades since 1938, American worker productivity has increased by a factor that economists document as substantial. Output per worker hour has roughly tripled since the FLSA was passed. The work week has not shortened. The productivity went somewhere. It did not go to time. The 40-hour week is not a natural law. It is a legislative choice made in 1938, in a specific political context, under specific pressures, as a substitute for a 30-hour proposal that had already passed the Senate and had 5 years of documented operational evidence behind it. The 40-hour standard has been the federal baseline for 86 years, not because it was proven optimal, not because it emerged from a comprehensive study of human productivity and well-being, but because it was the number that survived the substitution process that redirected the Black-Connery Bill toward the NERA and eventually toward the FLSA. The Kellogg experiment ended in 1985. The last 6-hour shifts in Battle Creek clocked out and did not return. The plant that had demonstrated for 55 years that a shorter workday was operationally viable and worker-preferred, reverted to the standard that the 1938 legislation had set. The productivity data from those 55 years is in the archive. The worker surveys are in the archive. The accident rate comparisons are in the archive. The legislative record of what the Black-Connery Bill said, what the Senate voted, and what the White House substituted for it is in the congressional record. None of it has changed the 40-hour standard. The question the archive leaves open is not whether a shorter work week is possible. The Kellogg records answered that question in 1930. The question is narrower and more uncomfortable. If the evidence existed in 1933, and the Senate had already voted, and the workers who lived under the 6-hour day consistently chose to keep it, what exactly was the 40-hour week protecting? The bill that passed the Senate never became law. The bill that replaced it is still in effect.